Right. Welcome to the Learning and Design Mastermind podcast, a podcast that focuses on instructional design related topics, including trends and issues in our field. I am Daisy Barreto, your host, and with me somewhere on the screen is our co-host, Sherry Conklin, and we are excited to be your guide as we explore the exciting topics in instructional design. In each episode, we explore the trends, case studies, and practical tips from professionals in our field that can help you deliver exceptional learning experience for your students and your faculty members. Are you working with them? So here with us today, we have Zach Morgan, who is an MIT alumnus. And Zach, could you please tell us more about your position, where you're currently working, and what you do?
Sure. Well, thank you all so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and to have this conversation. And as for where I am currently, I'm here at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and I work in our Office of Distance Education and E-Learning. Specifically, I'm one of the team leads over on the instructional design side of the house. And some of what that entails is I'm our training and quality assurance coordinator. I'm also one of our quality matters coordinators. So we do a lot of work with instructional technology integration with kind of top to bottom course and program design at any scale, whether that's the assignment or the whole program, evidence-based practices for course design, thoughtful uses of technology and online teaching and learning best practices. So that's my current role in a nutshell and serving as a senior instructional designer in that unit.
Thank you, Zach. That is exciting to hear how, like your role and what you're doing there at the office. So my first question to you, it is related to assessments, and I think a lot of people have different understanding or even
Yeah.
how to approach that. So can you talk with us a little bit? What are the key differences between summative assessments, formative assessments, and learning activities in online and hybrid courses
Yeah.
that instruction designers really need to know, especially as they may be engaging on that process with faculty members or even themselves are creating for a project? What would be some of your insights that you can share with them?
Absolutely. And I love this question to start off because I feel like it'll set some groundwork maybe for the rest of our conversation. And some of it we might look at it and say, well, that's just semantics, right? Why do we care whether we're calling this thing a learning activity or an assignment or an assessment, informative and summative? But it really does make a difference. And I think it makes a difference for the designer and like you said, for the designer who is collaborating with a faculty member and thinking about kind of the overall assessment strategy for the course. But also, if you're involved in developing any kind of training, I think that these distinctions will be useful. So maybe let's start with learning activities, and I'll try to just give a brief summary of each, and we can delve into those later on. Learning activities we can think about as something you're asking your students to do that just gets them to switch on their brain and actively engage, with you, with their peers, with the course content. And I think a key distinction that sets it apart from other things is learning activities are non-evaluative, right? We care that you're putting forth a good faith effort as a student or a participant, but we're not interested in right or wrong yet. We're not interested in kind of how polished it is. It's just, are you doing the mental processes that we know from learning science and cognitive psychology and educational psychology and organizational development, all these things, right? Are you doing the things that we know will promote learning? And in the online and the hybrid space, we really have some interesting ways, right, to do this because we can really guide students through the experience in a more intentional way and ensure that it's not only kind of the best or the most prepared students in the class that are having those experiences. And then you kind of move up a rung on the ladder and we can talk about formative assessments where we really do care about how well you're doing it, but it's still not the end of the road, right? Yet it's not the kind of concrete proof of can you do this thing or not do it? Do you know it or not do it? It's more diagnostic in nature about kind of, hey, this is a chance for you as the student and me as the instructor to get some information about how you're doing and what you're doing well and what you could still improve. So I think about, right, I'm not in as good a shape as I used to be. I started working with a trainer at the gym and they had me do a squat assessment, right? So they made me do my squat from all different directions and they see how my knees are doing all sorts of weird things. And, right, that's not an ultimate measure of how well can I squat. But it is giving me some diagnostic feedback about, hey, you may want to do these mobility exercises and these stretches, and this part's pretty good, but think about this sort of cue when you're, doing the movement and all these kind of things. So that's kind of a formative assessment, right? And then you get to summative, and summative does really matter, right? But now it's kind of time to prove it. Now we're about collecting that evidence that really is about, okay, are you ready to move forward in this course of study? Can you do the thing? Do you know the thing? And are we confident in that? And again, your trainees or your students. So I go back to my squat analogy, right? Let's say I'm in weightlifting one and I'm about to go on to weightlifting two. They may want to know that I can do a really good squat with good form at low weight before I start putting more weight on it. And it really does matter whether or not I can do it. But we've kind of gone from sort of, the practice activities and the stretches to the diagnostic to the more summative piece of it. So I heard an analogy once that formative is when the chef tastes the soup, summative is when the customer tastes the soup. And so you can kind of think of it that way as well. But, thinking about those different things and the purpose behind them is really key to getting that balanced assessment strategy and activity strategy throughout the whole class.
Thank you, Zeb, for sharing that. And I really like that all the analogies that you propose here, because I think it also speak of the importance, right? The importance of the distinction, and especially as you are working on them and planning for them, which then is going to lead nicely to my next question to you, which is how can instructional designers assist instructors in balancing the use of summative assessments with formative assessment to enhance the student learning experience and the whole process in a course or into a module.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one of the key roles that designers can play is helping to think through assessment strategy. And there are some fantastic activities and assessment ideas out there. So sometimes part of your job as a designer might be to recognize what's already there and, perhaps something that the instructor is already doing in their face-to-face class. And you think about translating that to a different medium. And it's not going to be right, just direct conversion. It really is a translation because we're talking about different mediums and different languages. And there's a word in this language that doesn't exist in this language. And so we have to think about how to do that thoughtfully. But let's say that you're looking, more expansive and to go beyond that in crafting the strategy. Alignment or instructional congruence or whatever you want to call it is definitely your friend here in terms of thinking about that curricular promise that the course is supposed to fulfill. And that begins with the course learning objectives, right? I mean, every syllabus is going to have those course learning objectives, those student learning outcomes. You'll see it called different things, but these broad statements of what students should be able to do by the end of the course. And what our team finds is a lot of times there's a lot of great conversation that can be had if you unpack those course learning objectives and kind of break them down and start thinking about, okay, well, what are all the things that somebody would need to do and be able to show you for you to feel confident that they can really do that objective? And you start breaking those things down. You say, well, you kind of have to know this, you have to be able to do this. You break it down into smaller parts. And then those activities and those assessments kind of start to emerge, right? You see the thing of, oh, well, we need to kind of do this in a stepwise fashion, and they need to be able to do this big project to really prove it to me. But then now, how are we going to break that down? And maybe we have some kind of formative checkpoints. Maybe the things where if we think about our learners up front, we think, where are they likely to struggle? Where are they likely to have some gaps in preparation coming to our program or to this course? Maybe that's where you kind of systematically or strategically look at some learning activities to ensure that they've had adequate practice and chances to kind of do some early experimenting and clarification. So I think those course objectives are another place, and just thinking about alignment all the way down, right? Are we moving toward that curricular promise of the course? And then I think the other way that designers can be helpful in this, right, is thinking about, again, the technology integration, particularly for online and hybrid. And so making sure, right, not only are we considering tools, and designers can help guide instructors toward tools that might be useful for a particular kind of assessment or activity, but can also, again, think of the tools through that lens of alignment too. And so think about, are we using the tool in an effective way? And also keeping in mind accessibility and privacy and things like that that we may touch on later. So I think those are two or three ways that designers can collaborate with faculty to kind of analyze the overall assessment picture and not lose track of the big picture vision, but also kind of break those down into small enough chunks that you can start to fit those in. And I guess that'd be my final point when I said fitting it in. You've got to think workload too, right? I mean, you've got to think what is actually feasible. How much time do you want students to be spending on the various parts of a module or a unit? And, do you have enough time for them to actually do the thinking and the work and the sort of scratch padding and the drafting? If you've got 9 hours worth of instructional materials for them to consume, it's going to be tough to fit in the actual doing and the applied part of it. So thinking about that balance of sort of consuming versus doing is, I think, an important component too.
No, it's so good that you're bringing that up because I do think that that balance is key when we talk about that. It's not just going to be exerting the students with assignments, but or at learning activities, which is the same thing too with the faculty, because the faculty are also going to have to review and provide feedback on those learning activities and assignments. So it does need to be that balancing that you are not, overwhelming either side, right? Like it really needs to be that balancing, and then also that is helping to the outcome, which is really getting that learning objective towards the end. And my next question to you is going to be more go ahead.
Yeah, and I was going to say that too, Daisy. You went and said that the balance of helping the instructors find these really good learning activities in that assessment, but also helping them to understand how to balance it. Like if you can't provide that feedback, then the students aren't going to keep moving forward.
Right.
I just had to say it. I know you already said it.
Yeah, the instructor workload piece so important there too, right? And can you feasibly, if it's intended to be used for feedback or feed forward, but that's just not feasible to do by the time the students have moved on to the next piece, then that matters. And that's, I think, yeah, designers can definitely sort of help to see that from the student perspective as well.
Correct. And that the notion that the iteration, right? I don't know if we touch on this, but I think the process being, and I think that's why it's meaningful to have the learning activities in those formative assessment, because then you can do that iteration process. It's not like, okay, this is like a one-time shot approach that is always going to be like this forever, but it gives you that diagnostic that, okay, maybe we don't we we can reduce, maybe it can be more thoughtful and meaningful how we move in this part of this assignment or assessment. Which then is going to lead me to my next question to you, Zach, which is more talking about, since we are, technology, a world being designed and carry with technology. My question to you is like, how can technology be leveraged to create effective and engaging assignments, such as like both learning activities and assessment? And then if you could provide some examples, that you may have used in or technology that you think that instructional designers should be thinking about, or they should maybe tap into to make that process effective as they're working with faculty.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a key piece of that difference we talked about earlier, right, between online and hybrid and then face to face. And of course, face to face classes leverage technology as well. But in the online and the hybrid space, the entire experience, at least during the online portion of hybrid or fully online course, right? Everything is mediated by technology. Everything we do, the learning management system and the tools we use, they are the university campus and the classroom and the study space. They're everything. And so I think one thing right up front is to think intentionally and with some deliberation about what technologies we use and why we use them. And that again goes back to that alignment piece of making sure we're not using tools just for the sake of using tools and, not doing variety just for the sake of variety. Because that can get overwhelming to students. It can get overwhelming to instructors if you're having to manage student questions on different tools. So, a few tools used really intentionally and with, some low stakes or no stakes opportunities for students to get comfortable with those tools, with the supports built in, the tutorials that they need built into the course, right? That's going to be more productive in the end than 4 or 5 tools used kind of haphazardly. And then as we think about sort of, well, what are the opportunities for assessments and activities and things like that? I think a really interesting area on the learning activity side is how can you make instructional materials and engaging with them an active experience rather than a passive experience? Because, a lot of times there's a lot of reading. And I mean, that's another kind of question, right? Is how much reading is enough, and are we being targeted and intentional and transparent with our students about, hey, you may be reading this whole chapter, but here's what you should be getting out of it, and actually these 7 pages are the ones you should really pay attention to, and the rest you should just kind of be browsing, right? But for the cases I think where a close and analytical reading really is important, one of the most important things I think you can do is just get students to respond to that in some way, right? You're giving them a stimulus. What's some kind of response that gets you engaged with it? And so, we see this sometimes with quizzes, and there's lots of great evidence on the testing effect and low stakes quizzing and this being an effective way to get those foundational pieces of knowledge under your feet. But I do think there's a lot of possibility as well in things like social annotation tools, for example. So this is a class of tool, right, where you can take a text or even a video, a document, a website, and annotate it as though you would mark up a Google Doc or a Word document or something like that. And the instructor can be an active presence in that space as well. And so then, right, it's almost sort of seminar style to where we're sitting around and we're discussing the text together. We just happen to be doing it asynchronously. And, if you sort of do that, and again, it's much more about your participation. I almost think about those activities as kind of like the participation grade of the online class. Then ultimately, right, hopefully you've connected with that reading or that website or that resource in a deeper way. As for assessments, there are some creative things that you can do, right? I've worked with several faculty who have done something akin to like a virtual poster session. And they've had students, right? It's part of a research project, and they've scaffolded it, and they've built up to this. Maybe the students have even written a paper, but like at an academic conference, they've created a poster or some sort of digital poster. And then it's almost like the gallery where you're in small groups and maybe you're fielding questions about your poster, or you're kind of analyzing the content of others' posters and things like that. And tools like the discussion board tool, but also tools like VoiceThread that are out there are ways to do those things where you might think that the online medium is a constraint to doing it, but actually you can do it in some interesting ways. And then I suppose the final thing I would say, right, is again, we don't want to set aside some of the things that do work well in face-to-face. I don't know if have you all ever seen the Cross Library, the Patricia Cross Library of instructional activities and methods. It comes out of the Angelo and Cross classroom assessment techniques that I'm sure many designers have seen cited hundreds of times in papers that they're reading. But it's Cross Academy. I'll see if I can find a link to share. But it's got fantastic activities. So I mean, think of this as your think, pair, share, your jigsaw, your sort of small groups, your structured debates, things like that. But what I love about this resource and sharing it is it gives you the activity in the face-to-face setting. So if you're hybrid, right, maybe you do that as a learning activity that then feeds into a formative or summative assessment later in the week. But if you're fully online, it also gives you some guidance on how to do that activity online and some suggested ways to do it technologically as well. So I think that's a great resource for faculty to be aware of.
Thank you, Zach. I think like the all of that you said is so nice and neat, and definitely providing the resource, because we could also share that on the video here for others that may not know and they may want to use it. It might be a good opportunity for them to have access. And then my last question to you, because we're getting to that time to wrap it up, is going to be really touching basing on this notion of accessibility, which I think is so important, and sometimes we're not talking enough, which is how can instructional designers either assist and work with instructors to ensure that assessments are inclusive and accessible to all students?
Yeah, that's a great question and so important again, particularly online where we really want to think about these things proactively, particularly accessibility, but also, the inclusive design of our assignments. And it can be very hard to retrofit while you're in the middle of a semester. And so I think there's several things, right? You've got kind of your baseline things that we can all do to make for more accessible learning environments from the get-go. And one of my favorites, I heard heading styles referred to once as the gateway drug to accessibility. And I think that's a great analogy, right? So like if you have a document, if you have a learning management page, a page in Canvas, right? If you have a worksheet, just putting those heading styles in, right? That really is kind of like the building block of organization that can help folks using assistive technology. But then you kind of go up and you think about things like, okay, well, do I have captions for my instructional videos? And those videos may well be an embedded and integral part of the assignment. You may be giving an assignment overview. And so you think about students who prefer to read with captions or who English may be a second language, or just in a situation where they can't hear the audio. That can be hugely beneficial as well. And then when it comes to tool selection, this really matters too. I mean, there are some tools out there, and I won't name names, that are fantastic tools, but they're not particularly accessible. And so, I'm not discouraging necessarily an instructor from considering that tool, but, do take it through its paces, right? I mean, do think about things like privacy of data, who owns the data, what sort of things do students have to provide to sign up for an account. The nice thing about using tools that are supported by your institution is by and large, they've already gone through a vetting process for those things. So there's a certain level of accessibility and privacy that they've already had to clear. But I think about things too, like just can you use the keyboard to navigate around on the tool? If you're not able to use a mouse. And so that's something very easy for instructors to test out on a tool. Can you press the tab key and get around as if you didn't have a mouse? And what is that experience like, right? I mean, is it annoying or is it pretty intuitive? And learning a little bit about the tools and how they function. And, then I think, again, you may have a perfect tool and you may want to use it. If it has one of those limitations, maybe just thinking about, okay, what's plan B for this, right? So if for some reason I'm not able to use this tool, do I have an alternative version of this assessment that would achieve the same learning objective or piece of the learning objective and be equally engaging, right? It might not look exactly the same, but do I have an equivalent alternative that I could lean on to bring into the course and to use that? And the other thing I would say is publisher technologies, publisher integrations. I'm a big fan of open educational resources, right? I'm not of using things that are already out there and not having students buy a textbook if there's something out there that they don't have to buy. With that said, sometimes the textbook really is a good source of information, and publisher tools have come a long way, particularly in terms of kind of the adaptive learning and those learning activities we talked about and being able to learn where students kind of have gaps and helping with that spaced repetition and quizzing and things like that. But sometimes the publishers are the worst offenders when it comes to accessibility. And so that's, I think, something for faculty to be mindful of as well, and designers too, about you may have a great publisher integration, but you may need to work with your faculty member who has access to it to get in there and kind of see what's available, and then also what the opportunities are, but also what the constraints might be.
Thank you, Zach. I think like what you share with us is there are such great insights, because I think we do need to be aware that it's not just here we have all this, but it's like how you can take each step of the way in the designing and be intentional about like that accessibility, right? Not only for the instructor providing the resource for students, the tools that they're going to be using for that. And then something to even consider too is like, the students themselves. And I think like, especially because we have instructional designers, in our courses, how they are also being thoughtful about the projects that they are creating to even be accessible as well, like for all students. And I think like as you mentioned, it goes a long way, even from a Word document to
Yeah.
the tools that we're using, the captioning process, and it truly takes that intentional and thoughtful process when you are doing the design.
It doesn't have to all happen at once, is just one thing I would add to that too. It can be daunting to look at that, or to look at sort of these changes to your activities or your assessments. It can start with a single assessment or a single activity, right? You could just pinpoint that thing. Yeah, my students always really struggle at this part of the course. So maybe that's kind of my jumping off point. Or, you know what, I could go through this semester and just focus on that heading styles piece and update those documents. It does not have to happen, complete top to bottom redesign all at once. That sort of plus one technique. And you hear that a lot in UDL circles and Universal Design for Learning. I think Tom Tobin talks a lot about that plus one mindset. And UDL is something we didn't mention, but I think that's another great framework for kind of just pick one of those UDL standards and look at it throughout the scope of your course and see where you can make those iterative improvements.
Thank you, Zach. We truly appreciate you coming and then sharing with us more about your insights and all your knowledge and experience. I know that we focus on assessment and accessibility throughout this talk. So we just want to, again, thank you so much. And then we're definitely going to have you come back again to give us more insights, because we don't have enough time to just cover everything in one episode, but we truly appreciate you to be here. And then for those that are watching and viewing our podcast, we also thank you all for being here with us.
Thank you all so much. It was a pleasure to be here.